Welcome to our open faith discussion this week on Talk of Christ, Faith, Family, and Adventure. I'm Steve Hunt. I have panelists here with me today to discuss, as Jacob just put it, whether Mormon Jesus would get vaccinated or not. Or can we ascertain that? We have the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, President Russell M. Nelson, and his counselors and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles issuing a statement about a week ago now. Well, it's longer than that, 10 days ago. Let me go to that statement here on the churchofjesuschrist.org newsroom site. Let's see, sharing the, here we go. First Presidency urges Latter-day Saints to wear face masks when needed and get vaccinated against COVID-19. And they said, dear brothers and sisters, we find, I guess this is just the First Presidency. I thought I said a second ago it was the Quorum of the 12 as well. It's First Presidency says, we find ourselves fighting a war against the ravages of COVID-19 and its variants, an unrelenting pandemic. We want to do all we can to limit the spread of these viruses. We know that protection from the diseases they cause can only be achieved by immunizing a very high percentage of the population. To limit exposure to these viruses, we urge the use of face masks in public meetings whenever social distancing is not possible. To provide personal protection from such severe infections, we urge individuals to be vaccinated. Available vaccines have proven to be both safe and effective. We can win this war if everyone will follow the wise and thoughtful recommendations of medical experts and government leaders. Please know of our sincere love and great concern for all of God's children. The First Presidency, President Russell M. Nelson, Dallin H. Oaks, and Henry B. Eyring. And then we have, I'm going to switch over to the, hang on just a second here. It's this one. Did LDS Church statement move the needle on vaccines and masking? Yes and no. This is from Peggy Fletcher Stack at the Salt Lake the Tribune, saying Latter-day Saints may preach and sing about following their prophet, but last week's statement by faith's top leaders urging members to wear masks and get vaccinated offered a glimpse of how seriously the faithful take that mantra. And so they've issued their strong statement, and the effect, this says, was a pronounced obvious change, says Tim May of Vancouver, Washington. In his own anecdotal, ward, I guess, he says, last week we had 1 to 2 families masked, and this week every family but one was masked. And the First Presidency's message was read aloud in some other wards and stakes, and people would wear masks, and mask wearing increased from less than 10% in recent weeks to over 80%, said some leaders of an Olympic Park ward in Park City. Here's another in a Montana ward, it didn't seem to change a thing. No letter was read, and only visitors were wearing masks. And another, let's see, historian Benjamin Park was disappointed to see only 5 out of 50 adults wearing masks in his ward. And yeah, so I mean, I think that despite the title or the subtitle of this article, that some witness, I guess that's the key word there, some witness a decided increase in the number of members following their prophet. And that just must mean wearing masks. So anyway, here we are today discussing, is it right for the First Presidency to issue such a dictum to the members of the church, go get vaccinated, wear masks? Is this a religious issue? Is this something prophets should be speaking about? That's one question that we could discuss. Also, do Mormons have Mormons? Does it appear that members of the church are following that counsel? Should they? What do we think of that? And then the question has come up that Daniel has put forth, can members disagree on these kinds of points? Can they get personal revelation in general, not just on this area, but in other areas, and disagree with their prophet? So those are some things that I invite you guys to chime in on and discuss on here today. Who wants to get us started in this discussion? And I know that we have some other statistics about vaccination in Utah. Daniel, do you want to get us started on the questioning and on these things, and maybe point out what the statistics show?
Yeah, do you want to share that chart up on your screen? Yeah, this is just something that I came across a few minutes ago. If you scroll down,
Yes, this part.
yeah. So there's kind of been a slightly steady increase the number of vaccinations per day in Utah. It looks like going back to like here beginning of July. Um, but the statement was issued 10 days ago on the 12th. So it's not a lot to go off of. We're only talking 10 days, but there certainly doesn't seem to be a huge noticeable spike. I don't know if we should expect to see that, but from at least from this chart, how accurate it is, it doesn't seem like there's been a huge uptick in the number of vaccines in Utah, which, within a state that's over 50% LDS, you'd expect, that if it had made a huge difference, I would think that there would be more of an uptick if it was making a noticeable difference, which I'm not seeing. Anecdotally, just from like comment sections and social media and stuff, I feel like I've seen a lot more comments, people saying, well, I'm still not getting vaccinated, than I have people saying, I'm going to follow the prophet. Like probably, 90% are saying, I'm still not going to get vaccinated. Whereas maybe 10% or less are saying, well, the prophet said so. And even though I have reservations, I'm still going to do it.
I mean, have you seen that? Have you experienced someone who said it that way?
Yeah, like I went around, like I looked at the Facebook comments on the Facebook post of the first presidency message, like from the church newsroom, like official Facebook page. Right. They've probably since shut down comments, but at the time when I was looking at it, there was a few saying, well, I'm going to follow the prophet and trust what he says. Which,
I wonder, has anybody seen like a poll out there? The prophet says, get vaccinated, wear masks. What's your response? I'm doing it. I agree. Has anybody come across anything like that? That'd be interesting.
I haven't.
No, I do have a couple observations to make just quickly. First off, I'm sure there's some place where you can just walk in and say, hey, let me get the vaccination. For mine, I know I scheduled mine ahead of time and it was more than a week out. And so before we can say really if this is having any effect to the positive or if it's just being ignored, I think we probably need a bit more time. Maybe after a month, a couple months, we can say like, okay, from that point, what happened? Another one observation was to your second point of social media and people commenting on that. This is something I realized on the early days of Reddit. Maybe Facebook's a little bit different, but like internet Mormonism is like a microcosm of what's going on in the church as a whole. You get loud people. I was teaching the young adults at the time. I was teaching 16 to 18-year-olds. I had two classes combined because I was the only one that was teaching. And I was a single teacher. For some reason, I didn't have a team teacher. But long and short of it is, I was on Reddit and I was seeing all these people going through a faith crisis and stuff like that. And so for some reason, I was thinking like, this is probably what the teenagers in my class are going through. When reality couldn't be further from the truth. They were all reading their For Strength of Youth pamphlet, and like they were 100% bought on that. They weren't the teenagers that were on Reddit having a faith crisis. And so trying to judge what's going on with social media based on, hey, this amount of people are saying it doesn't change my mind. It's usually the ones that have something that goes against the grain. They're going to come out and say something, as opposed to those that those that usually follow the prophet. They don't go and answer to the world. In my experience, from being on the internet, they just do it quietly on their own. And so I think what we're seeing there has to be taken with a grain of salt.
Good point. I wanted to switch real quick back to this utah.gov page showing the vaccine percentage here, the colors here. I guess I've got it on percent fully vaccinated. I guess we should do percent. Let's see, percent at least one dose of 12 plus. That is probably the most important number here. It shows that anybody who's eligible to receive it that has started down the path, so they're not anti-vaccine. And we have some pretty solid numbers up here to the east. Is this is this Park City? is that where that the only area that's in that area right there?
All the out-of-state.
And yeah, exactly. People who aren't not members of the church and don't actually live here all the time. And then we have the Salt Lake County area at a high percent. I can't tell what color that is. It looks like it's somewhere in the 70 to 90 range. And then we get kind of a 60% in some other outlying down to 50-ish. And then these much more rural areas down below.
You got to drive 50 miles into town to get that vaccine on your tractor. Not everyone's
So as a state, anybody know how this compares then with other states? That would have been stuff. These are good stats that we could have pulled together before we jumped on here to pretend like we actually know what we're talking about. But I get the feeling that that Latter-day Saints or that Utahns are probably on par with other states of their size and general political leaning. I don't see here evidence that we're not getting vaccinated or that we are getting vaccinated. It's just kind of a, all right. Who else? I guess the question that let's, how about this? Should prophets be making statements? Should leaders of churches be making statements to their congregations and people, whether they're prophetic or not, but you can focus on that, saying, go get vaccinated? What are your thoughts?
I can pipe in on that one. Whether or not they should, obviously that's up to them. But one other angle on this of some people I've talked to that are kind of anti that, they're like, well, this isn't like a thus saith the Lord statement. It's just simply a PR statement. And I'll agree with this to some degree, saying like, it seems like one of the main focuses of this urge to get vaccines, obviously, I think President Nelson, being a surgeon and a doctor, would be, all on board. He's like, idiots, come on, figure it out. But, and that's from his, his man side, not like you don't even need inspiration from God to get that opinion from him. But also, I think the church as a whole really doesn't want to shut down again, because that, I don't know if you watch General Conference, but it's not that fun when, there's no audience there. But I think it's kind of a mix between, yes,
nobody to laugh at all the jokes.
No one laughs at the jokes. It's just dry. It's like almost watching like a terrorist statement from a hidden bunker, right? Except for the message is about Jesus, not terrorism. But usually, no.
Wow.
No, always. But so I think a lot of it is kind of the PR, like, we're the best interest of the church is what we're looking at right here, obviously, and of the people, but it's not necessarily a political statement in that it's like, this is the government's it is kind of, it's like, do what the government says. That's one of our articles of faith, as we are, we follow the law of the land. So reiterating that to your members should be fine. But at the same time, I think they're saying it's in our best interest as a church to do this too, because, hey, I don't know if you've noticed this, but at church, you have to gather in large groups of people. And if we don't want to get shut down again, we're going to have to do this. Now, as far as whether or not I'll say this too, and I will agree though with some of the anti people, not with their reasoning and their conclusion, but that this was not a prophetic statement, or at least it wasn't given the impression. It didn't say like, I spent many a hard night praying what could help the church get through the pandemic, and I started dictating this after I had the Spirit influence me to do this. Not saying that couldn't be the case, but it wasn't presented that way. And I have some other.
It's interesting when you said that just now. I had the first. I hadn't ever considered this before. A year ago, we fasted and prayed as a church that the pandemic, that the solutions would be found, and then the pandemic would be overcome. And now we're a year into this. And it hadn't occurred to me until you were just talking, Corey, that the speed with which scientists and doctors were able to develop a vaccine could be seen as an answer to that kind of prayer and fasting, when you assume that God is working through those medical channels and providing those things. And, because the whole time, because on the other hand, you can sit here and say, well, we fasted and prayed. This should have been over a week later, and or you can say, yeah, but in the past, it's taken a decade to make a vaccine. And this time it took months, 8 to 10 months. And, with all the prelude, the science that's come before. Anyway, Daniel, I think you wanted to chime in there while Corey was talking too.
Yeah, I was going to say something from like the more ex-Mormon perspective, from somebody who hangs out in a lot of like the ex-Mo circles and chat rooms and sees what people are saying. It's kind of the cynical view that a lot of ex-Mormons have, that people, like, the church is issuing this statement because it's hurting their bottom line. People aren't coming to church, tithing kind of drops off. They're making less money, less butts and seats. We need to issue this statement. I don't know that I'd go that far. I see some reasoning behind that argument.
Do they
I
do they
think it's overly
mention that
simplistic.
there's a massive savings in not having to staff and turn on the temples for the year? I mean, does that come up in the circles?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Not having to open the churches, not having to keep the lights on. Anyways, no expenses.
I just went back while you guys were talking, went back and looked at the statement again and read over it. And something I hadn't really noticed before, there's really nothing about it being a revelation. There's no talk of, spiritual, revelation behind this. This is what the government and medical experts are urging. I'm sure that's, intentional.
Well, and that's kind of my question, I guess, is that when there is no spiritual backing, no revelation, is it the role of leaders of any church, but especially those who call themselves prophets, seers, and revelators? What do we think? Is it our role to criticize and ask this question? But to get up and make a statement like this, if this wasn't a revelation from God, it's just.
I think it's certainly within their rights, and I'll add that I'm glad they said it. Maybe this would be a good time to comment a little bit on my own personal feelings about it. Like, I wish they did this sooner.
Absolutely.
I was in the camp, they should have done it sooner. They should have made it more strongly worded. And it's a little disappointing that it took this long to come out. And, I kind of understand why it is, because they knew that a lot of members would react the way that they are actually reacting now that they have come out and issued this statement. It's kind of a lose-lose for them. They're always going to upset a group of people when you come out with an official statement. So anyways, yeah, I was glad that they issued the statement. I think they're well within their rights to do that. I have mixed feelings about the response to it, because there's been people saying, well, the prophet said it, I'm going to get vaccinated, which on the one hand, anybody getting vaccinated who wouldn't otherwise is, in my mind, a good thing. I still disagree with the reasoning. I think blind obedience is a dangerous path to go down. I don't think they should be doing anything just because the prophet said so. And then it's frustrating to watch people saying, well, I have agency and I'm not going to get vaccinated even though the prophet said so. And that's frustrating, because I think in this instance the prophet's right. But it's frustrating because they when I have an issue with something the prophet says and don't want to do it, they don't allow me that same courtesy. They recognize my agency per se, but they'll say that I'm wrong, to do that. So I don't know. It seems like a double standard to me.
Good points. Joey, did your congregation leaders have they said anything at all about vaccines, masks? What's going on in your congregation?
Yeah, actually, that's exactly what I've kind of been researching since we decided on this topic. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, go ahead.
This one, I think. I'll just scroll back up. So this is actually a blog post on my church's website, August COVID update. And here's their current recommendations. First of all, God is in charge of everything, so we can't forget to pray and trust God. But bullet point number 2, if you haven't been vaccinated, we encourage you to do so. Now, again, and you've been saying this several times, Steve, whether it's right or not for a prophet to issue, edicts like this. My church leaders would not claim any kind of special prophetic authority. They do claim to be ministers of Christ, ministers of the word. And so I think they do even say at their last session meeting, they discussed, I thought they mentioned that they discussed and prayed about, but yeah, they're meeting as a leadership body in the church and discussing, what's prudent, what is, what does, what's our responsibility to be in careful leadership of the church, Feel free to wear a mask during service. We won't judge anyone's spiritual state by whether they wear a mask or not. They continue to have a seating section that's socially distanced, and you can RSVP to sit in that section if you prefer, or if you have anybody in your family who's immune system is compromised or whatever reason, right? We're not going to judge your spiritual state by whether you wear a mask and where you want to sit, right? And they've said that their practice was always to follow the guidelines given by local health officials, and they plan to continue doing this. And they're hoping that it doesn't come to, scaling back the services or, requiring people to during the pandemic, when we first started opening up and having people come back to church, we were having people RSVP, and they kept the seating sections all separate from each other. They stopped doing a lot of that when a lot of the mask mandates and things started being lifted, but now the variants are ramping back up. They're looking into, should we start doing some of that stuff again? But I thought this section was interesting. What matters even more right now is our unity as a church, right? And he's talking about how some churches have split because they didn't like how their church handled COVID. I think this is my pastor writing this, but to my knowledge, no one left our church because of this. And it wasn't because we all agreed on it. He's worried that, if we aren't unified in our response to this, that reflects poorly on Christ's body. And so his prayer more than anything is just that we'll be unified in our response to this. And that was an interesting thought, is that there are more important things than how we respond to this. But yeah, still they felt the need to. And I was going to look and see, I was trying to go back in time and see other updates that they did throughout because I know they've come out with an update probably every other month throughout the whole pandemic. What are we doing differently at church because of this and that sort of thing. So I have no idea how my church compares to other local churches in their, the way they're handling it. I have no idea, but I don't. Well, to answer your question, Steve, is it right or not for a church leader to put out, guidelines like this? I think it's 100% right. I mean, like you were saying a second ago, like church is a gathering of people, right? And it's a place where this virus can spread. And so if we're following government guidelines and being responsible citizens of the communities that we live in, it is in everyone's best interest for us to be careful when we're meeting together. You have to balance that. I mean, Christ commanded us to fellowship together, and I don't know if doing church over Zoom counts. So I think I get it when people are kind of up in arms about, the government's trying to oppress the churches and make us all stop having church, and I get it, but at the same time, it's like, it's not the government's fault. They didn't, well, I mean, conspiracy theories, right? They didn't create the virus, right? We for better or worse, we're in a pandemic. And so let's do the right thing during the pandemic and get it over with as fast as we can by, following the guidelines.
Joey, all the governments of the world got together for this conspiracy. This is the first time they've all acted in concert together to do this, to oppress all the nations of the world.
Yeah.
No,
so I think it's 100% right for Nelson to come out with a statement like this. Well,
I appreciate your thoughts on it. It helped me to see by reading your church's statement, because I've been so focused inward and on my own church and on what, criticism perhaps that I may just naturally and unfortunately feel towards my own church leaders or whatever, that I am saying, should they be saying things like this? And I agree with what has been said here, that actually they should, especially where our prophet is a medical doctor and there are other medical doctors up there. It just kind of makes sense just that they would issue such a thing. But now stepping back and seeing what your church has done has helped me to see, okay, now wait a minute. If a church isn't saying something about the massive pandemic that is currently facing all of humanity, what are isn't that part of why we have these congregations and these opportunities to come together and worship and to help one another in these times of trial, is so that we can hear words of guidance, words of comfort, words of help from our church leaders. And so, yeah, you would expect them to get up and say something like, when there's a drought, we should pray for rain and we should conserve water. And when, there's a pandemic, we should pray for healing and we should get vaccinated, right? It's kind of a, something you would definitely expect. I'm interested, Joey, to know, does your church collect collections for assistance with tithing and church funds and whatever only in church, or is it possible to do outside of church online? I'm hearkening back to Daniel's ex-Mormon focus on the money for a second.
So, going back 5-6 years, they were passing a plate every Sunday and collecting money that way. But so long before the pandemic started, the pastoral staff kind of were talking about it and thinking about it, and there's nothing in the Bible that talks about passing around a collection plate. It's not. It probably, it's a practice that started, I think, in the early 1900s. And they kind of made the decision as a leadership body in the church that, actually, we're going to stop passing around the plate and we're going to come up with better ways of doing this, And so they now there's a box in the back of the chapel where you can drop a donation if you want, but they opened up like PayPal donations and other ways to donate online. I myself have used my bank's like bill pay, which I think mails a check to the church, but yeah, I don't use cash much personally. I don't know. That's personal preference for me. I pay all my bills electronically. So when I make my offering to the church, I've done it using my bank's bill pay for years and years. But yeah, they've opened up ways of donating online. And I don't know, that's an interesting question. I don't know if the pandemic has hurt the giving that's coming in. I don't even know the answer to that question. I haven't been curious about it, but
I mean, just
can I clarify something too real quick? And it isn't, because it is obviously in the LDS church, it's not typically done through, it's not like they pass around a plate. You can pay online, but it's more so that people, when they don't go to church for extended period of time, they get out of the habit. And in some cases, and again, this is anecdotal, but like I've seen this like in my own family situation, like with my wife, she hasn't been to church in like a year plus. And it's like, you realize that life goes on without it. You know what I mean? You get used to not going. And when it starts back up again, it's just kind of like, I'm not really missing it, and that happens to a lot of people. They realize like, why was I going to church all this time? I'm not even missing it now that I'm not going. So they stop paying tithing. It's not because they're not physically there, but because they kind of are losing interest in the church. So that's kind of, I think, what a lot of people are speculating is happening, that the pandemic's bad for the church, not just tithing, but, and just general loss of interest in the church, overall.
And that's certainly a good point. I mean, the pandemic doesn't seem to be good for any organization or business that was running a certain way before the pandemic. Everything's got to change, so it's just kind of done differently. All right. So I think we feel like it's right for leaderships in congregations, churches, to speak up about the pandemic, to say something. It seems wise for them to come down on the side of what apparently is the scientific consensus around the world, that the vaccine works and that masks work. And so are we seeing that result? We looked at the statistics that we could find, and we could barely see that. I mean, the trend for vaccination in Utah has been ticking upward consistently for over a month or so. But and other than that, we don't see a massive spike because of what the First Presidency said. How about in your local congregations? I know that I visited a congregation with my daughter a week ago, right after the announcement, where it seemed everybody was wearing masks. And actually, my daughter and I were the only ones not. So it was like we had just walked into this congregation, and I don't know if they had previously all been doing that. And so we were just the outsiders. My daughter and I have been vaccinated, and so we have this kind of feeling that we're okay. And maybe that's wrong, because But anyway, the point is, we didn't wear them. And then this week, I just forgot. I had intended to, because of the council of the First Presidency, I'd intended to wear a mask to church. Showed up at church without a mask and looked around and went, "Oh, look, the bishopric is wearing masks. Actually, 2 of the 3, but I'm not." and then looked around the church and realized it still looked like it was only about a third of the congregation that was in masks in my ward. How about you guys? What are you seeing?
I can speak up. I just went to church right before this, and last week I think everyone was like, what are we doing with this? Because like I'm in Utah County, and people were done with, they don't want them masks back, right? So last week everyone was like, till they make me, I'm probably not going to do it, or maybe everyone hadn't heard the announcement. There was like 3 or 4 families that were doing it. 2 members of the bishopric were, not everyone. This week, all the bishopric had the masks on. I'd say about 60% of people had the mask on, and my wife's out of town, so we spaced it. So I'm like, oh, right, this whole thing. Forgot about that.
We're the ones not following the prophet right here in this call.
Well, yeah, and so that's what I've seen. And I mean, this is a good place as any, like, for a hot take on like politically where like I stand on this type of thing in general. Is like, I feel like, well, I can be swayed one way or another, and I get like that we're passing more, but I feel like a lot of people, especially like Republicans right now, or if you're conservative, just like, when Trump was the president, everyone hated the government that was Democrat pretty much, and now everyone that's Republican kind of hates the government because it's the other side. And so I think people have a general mistrust of, government telling you what to do, but that goes both ways. But as far as like, the way I can see is people do a lot of risk assessment, right? And so that's the number one driver. It's probably not even going to be, especially for more conservative people, it's not necessarily going to be even your prophet or your government or anyone telling you what to do. It's like, hey, there's an uptick in this virus. I can assess my risk. Therefore, I'm going to go get vaccinated. Until the Delta thing started hitting, I wasn't vaccinated because I was like, looks like this thing's on the way out. I work from home. I hardly see a soul. I do go to church, I guess, but the way I view it is like, here's the thing, is the best solution and the only solution that we have to this, because there's going to be Delta variant, then there's going to be Z variant, like there's going to be infinite variants. COVID's never going away. We're never going to have zero COVID. So the best solution we have right now is a vaccine. And is that 100% effective? No. Are there probably some vaccine injuries? Hopefully a lot less than the conspiracy theorists think, but probably some, yes, because that's just how any vaccine works. So if you're going to do a risk assessment, you get the vaccine. And then at that point, at least from the way I'm feeling, a lot of people that maybe are of the same political persuasion as me and LDS in this area, is like, the government's role is now done. Because there's nothing else you can possibly do. We can mask up every time a new variant comes, but that means we're going to be masking up for till the end of time, because COVID's never going away to zero, and that's never going to happen. And so when people hear mask mandates, they're thinking, well, see, like, I got the vaccine, and if I didn't, I don't really care, and I'm taking I'm doing what I want. I'm taking my agency into my own hands. And I do get this, I'm like, well, you're spreading it to other people. It's like, I don't know, like, because as of most things, I'm of 2 minds, and I'm not exactly sure which way to go. But I only say this to say, I think that's where a lot of people are right now, at least in the Utah County area, which is kind of like Mormonism central, right? So
they've made their calculated risk decisions, and what the prophet says, you don't think for most people plays a huge role.
Unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on your point of view, I think 2020 especially has proven that for a lot of people, politics trumps religion. Meaning, if your political leanings are one way, no matter, even if your prophet says something, you're going to go with your politics. Maybe not 100%, but anyone that was like pretty far to a certain end, they're not going to budge. I think the middle people that were like, I don't know, could go either way.
We've pointed that out before on this call. Somewhere I read that people, when their politics and their religion clash, they go with their politics is the study that someone was saying. So that's an interesting, they bend their religion to fit their politics. And I can see that. And
unfortunately, unfortunately this hit, or like maybe it was planned if you're a conspiracy person, right? But it's happened in an election year, and unfortunately something that really shouldn't have been politicized, in my opinion, in any shape or form, is highly politicized. And so the tribalism instinct of every human is kicking in, right? And they're, even if like logic says I should do a thing, I just on principle can't do it. and I can't prove hypotheticals, but based on the talk that was before the election, I feel like the other side would have been doing the same thing almost, because they were sort of before like, I don't know, if it came from that guy, I wouldn't trust it. Or, I think the election would have been, it's the cleanest, best run election according to Democrats right now. But I think if they lost, also Democrats would be like, well, it was totally corrupt and we can't trust it. And Republicans would have been on the other side like, no, this is the cleanest, most fair election that's ever run. So, and this is hard because I think this is the thing that the gospel's trying to get us to overcome in general, is the natural man way of tribalism. And I think right now, this is what we're, any church, any body as a humanity, this is a big test, not necessarily in that we're all going to die. I mean, people will die, but can we stay together, or will tribalism ultimately rip us apart? And that's what's been kind of scaring me lately. And rant.
So yeah, I mean, it sounds like what we're saying is that the statement, whether it's Nelson's statement or the statement of the first presidency, the statement kind of comes in late enough in the game that everybody's kind of made up. Maybe there's a few people on the fence that hadn't made up their mind, and maybe this will help them make up their mind. But for the most part, they're preaching to the choir, right? The people who are going to get vaccinated have already been. Although that's interesting, Corey, that you mentioned that you weren't vaccinated until recently. So you're part of that uptick on the graph.
Well, that's the thing, is it was not because of what he said though.
But it wasn't right. It was
before.
Before.
I saw. Yeah, but I mean, that's just me. I'm sure some people are, and I would wager that no one would start wearing masks around where I was unless they had said something. That's
I think that's true. Even I was like, oh, I should start wearing masks again because the first presidency said so. But that's not because that's not because they're the first presidency and prophets, seers, and revelators, but because they're the presidents and the overseeing our congregation and our church, and they've asked us to wear masks again to church. So it's kind of like, okay.
It's like if the place you worked asked you to do that, it's like, hey, if you want to keep coming here, this is what you got to do. You're like, okay, cool, I'll do it.
Yep.
Yeah, not because it's
crazy
some
to me.
directive from God. God asked me to wear a mask.
Like you were just saying, Corey, it's crazy to me that this ever became a political thing in the first place, And I don't know what is going on. Our country is so divided right now along political lines. And if it's the internet, right? It's Facebook, all the echo chambers, where people can get together and talk to each other like in their own little world where everyone else agrees with them, and it just causes everyone to like spin further and further away. And it's nuts. It's aggravating. I don't understand. I'm with Steve. What is it you like to say? You're extremely moderate.
I'm extremely
I consider
moderate.
myself
my
an independent. View. I would not identify as a Democrat, although I'm probably a lot more politically liberal than I want to admit. But I've voted for Republicans and I've voted for Democrats, and it's crazy to me. And so the other thing I've been kind of trying to research in the last day or two since we just sort of landed on this topic is,
Joey, you voted for the other side? They're all wizard.
I did. The other thing I've been trying to desperately to like Google search and like see if I can find anything at all. Was there any politicization of like the polio vaccine back in the 50s and 60s? And the best I can find is that there were some people who were afraid of it, like from a scientific or medical standpoint, but I haven't been able to read anything honestly, it's like a cursory bit of Googling. I haven't like really dived into the research, but I can't find anything anywhere that says, oh yeah, the Republicans were all getting their kids vaccinated and the Democrats weren't, or vice versa, right? I haven't been able to find anything like that. I don't think it was a political issue back then. It was just, there's this scary disease that's hurting our children. Let's get them all vaccinated and squash the thing, And I don't know why why aren't we coming together as a nation and saying we need to eradicate this thing? Why has it become this crazy, don't tread on me political thing, And I mean, in some ways, that's a very easy question to answer. It's just the political milieu that we're in right now is that everything becomes political. But I think that's very disappointing to me. And I say that, I hope, as one who is not pro-vaccine and pro-masks just because of my political views, but yeah.
I could say, just as a conservative, I do have, I'm gonna get this vaccine, or I got the vaccine, right? So I had that going into it, but I will admit, I'm like, there's still something about it that's just like, I just want everyone to know, like, I'm not doing this because they told me to. I'm doing it because I'm smart and I can do my own dang risk assessment. I don't like people telling me, like, I'm still like that. And I think, I don't know. I just think people right now are, well, because I'm saying, like, I do still see the trepidation. Like, I do think they're doing, like, some people might be overplaying it because, like, again, it's just going to go on forever and ever. And like, I know, like, I do have, I listen to some conservative thing and I listen to some liberal stuff all the time, but I'm like, I do see, like, I'm generally distrustful of authority in general. So like, I do see the government trying to play this up so that they can get all their agendas through and all that. Like, I do think that's part of it. But at the end of the day, again, no matter, even if that's the case, like, sorry, there is a disease, it's real, it's killing people, and you're either gonna, like, the way I see it, like, you're either gonna eventually get COVID, or everyone's going to get COVID. And so it's just like, do you want to get it vaccinated or do you want to get it unvaccinated? And statistics, hopefully you don't need a prophet to tell you that, like, it seems like the smart thing to do is just even if you think vaccines are risky, like, the risk from the vaccine seems to be less than the risk from dying from COVID from a certain age group, right? So me, I'm old enough, looks like I should get it. My kids, that's another matter, but they can't get it anyway. So, but there you go.
Cool.
I'm going to stop.
I'll hop in. I'll share my congregational experience as well as, so last week I was actually in Kansas City at a trade show. For my work, I travel to a lot of big jewelry trade shows because we sell to retail jewelry stores. And what's interesting is at least as far as masks go, the approach is kind of been the same. So last Sunday I was at the trade show, and so I wasn't at church. And the trade show, we were in Kansas City where they have an indoor mask mandate. And so it was interesting. It was a 3-day show. The first day at the very beginning, everyone was wearing masks, but then, like, they're kind of creeped down below the nose. And there was a security guard that walked by, like, hey, get those masks up. Get those masks up. Halfway through the first day, pretty much no one had them over their nose. We're like hovering around down this area. The security guard had stopped. He realized he was losing. It was a losing battle he was fighting. By the end of the first day, over half the people weren't even wearing the masks. Second and third day, the vast majority of people weren't wearing masks. And it was just something that they're like, yeah, this is, it was just an annoyance. We don't really care about it. And I mean, I guess Kansas City, I haven't really looked into the political leanings. But like, people weren't really afraid of it. And they're like, look, we're already in these close quarters anyway. In my congregation this week, it was kind of the same in that we came in, and I'd say probably about 80% had masks on. Only 2 of the 3 of the bishopric were up there because one stayed home, had a sick family. So one of the 2 there were wearing masks. The bishop was wearing his mask. But as the meeting progressed, it seemed like people saw other people not wearing masks and were getting more comfortable. I think probably dropped below 50% by the end of the meeting were wearing their masks. And the bishop, by the time where you do sacrament after the first hour now. And so by the time sacrament rolled around, he wasn't wearing his mask either. And I think also part of it is they went back to the social distancing, right? So they're empty rows. And part of the urging from the first presidency was, wear masks when social distancing isn't possible. And so just me personally, because we were 6 feet away from everyone else during the first hour, I didn't wear a mask. But I also teach in primary the second hour, since we're all there in one room. I decided to wear the mask mostly for the comfort of others because the kids were wearing their masks. My team teacher was. Just my personal view, I don't think masks really work, and not because the masks themselves don't work. I don't think the application is ever going to get to a point where it's actually effective. The way people wear masks, the way people use them, whether they're washing them or not, and I think that the numbers that we looked at before, right? Some of the most strictest places with mask mandates had the highest numbers of COVID. I mean, you can say what you will about population, but to me that said, by and large, it doesn't seem like trying to do this big mask mandate, you're fighting a losing battle, like the security guard, because even though it was something that was supposed to happen, if everyone did it, great. But there's such a large portion of people that weren't doing it that it didn't make a big difference. I think we see something different with the vaccine because numbers dropped dramatically where people, as soon as the vaccine came out, right, and people were getting tested and a lot more negatives. And then we see the people that are being hospitalized. And so, my personal view on that is, like my brother, right, like Corey just described, it seems like it's the better choice. I'm not, I mean, I know I have propaganda being spewed at me from both ends, whether it's like full-fledged, we can do this. Everyone, go put that thing on your Facebook, and this is the best thing that's ever happened. Right? Probably not. There's probably still a lot of testing that could have been done, and there's probably some things that probably got missed because it was rushed. But at the same time, is there a cabal that's trying to take over the earth and using this pandemic as a way? I don't think that is it either, right? And so politically, and like a lot of other things, and I think a lot of us fall into this category. Right? I'm pretty moderate where it comes to views on these things and politics in general. I know that we started wanting to take this more in a role of, okay, so what does that mean when it comes to personal revelation, and if we disagree with the prophet? I think we should probably look at the way that the letter was worded, because I think this probably went through a number of lawyers and a bunch of people like, you put this out there, right? People are going to take this, whether you say it's a revelation or not. So people are going to say, the prophet spoke it. You either do it or you're not following the prophet. So I think it's interesting the word that they used. And Daniel, you might want to focus on a different part of this, but like when they're talking about the social distancing, the masking, and the vaccines, talking about urging, right? They stayed away from commanding. They stayed away from, this is what we're going to do. It's an urge, right? And if we go to, I just looked up on the internet, just Google has urge as, let's see, I had that pulled up. It just says to earnestly or persistently try to persuade someone to do something. So looks like they're persuading, but still leaving room for that, hey, there's still agency here. And so, I can't put words in their mouths.
So you think that they've actually baked into this particular announcement the ability to disagree without feeling like you're being judged for disagreeing, kind of as Joey's church leaders baked into their page. Look, we're not going to judge you based on your mask wearing or not, and so you feel like that's what the First Presidency has done here as well. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think it's like a very strong recommendation of like, this is, hey, you should probably be doing this. But just like if you were to go and eat in one sitting 10, Big Macs, it's probably not the best thing to do. And they're not going to sit there and judge you as an ecclesiastical leader. It's like, yeah, that probably is what the word of wisdom is going against, at very least when it's talking about meat, if not about, using things in moderation. So yeah, I think it's something where I don't think there's ever going to be any church discipline, or there's not going to be like, hey, we're going to stop people from being able to come to church unless you've been vaccinated. I don't think they're going to start carding people, but I think it more goes to their feeling of an obligation of, hey, like we've already talked about, we're a place where we gather, right? Well, at its worst, COVID is very, very communicable. It gets spread very fast, and the last thing we want to do is become a super spreader event every Sunday when we get together. So let's try and tell people they can do this, but we're not going to go to the point of forcing them or judging them if they're not doing it.
So, I get the sense from this group that first of all, we all think it's very appropriate for church leaders to stand up and say something about the pandemic, and specifically to encourage their congregations to take some wise steps in order to prevent and slow the transmission of COVID-19, including vaccination and masks. We all have slightly different and varying opinions about the pandemic, about the efficacy of vaccinations, maybe masks. But we also see around us the political viewpoints that, for better or for worse, this is some kind of a political discussion. And it appears to, I think most of us here, that people have staked down, taken up their political positions on masks and on vaccines, and they're unlikely to be heavily persuaded by the statements of their church leaders right now. They may decide to go ahead and wear masks at church because they've been encouraged, but whether they believe that's the right thing or whether they think it actually works isn't being persuaded by what their church leaders say, probably. And whether they go out and get a vaccine is apparently, in we think most cases, something that they've probably already decided whether they were going to do at some point or not. So that's where I think we are on this. It feels like people have taken up some kind of a political stance, and what their church leaders say, which right now church leaders aren't taking, this is a revelation from God. This is what God commands. Jesus would get vaccinated. Jesus would wear a mask. That's not being said. it's kind of, we urge you, as Jacob was saying. And so because that's all that's being pressed over the pulpit, nobody's probably changing their view. But now, to wrap this up with probably another 10, 15 minutes of conversation on what if the church does say something, this is the way it is, here's a church doctrine. The question this kind of has that Daniel wanted to get into, and let's spend a few minutes on it. When you do disagree with the policies and doctrines of the church, and we've brought this up on many videos, and most recently on what's the role of a prophet, but can Latter-day Saints truly take a position that says, look, I have sought personal revelation on this issue, and I received personal revelation that seemingly disagrees with what the prophet is saying, so I'm taking it another route? How is that received? Is it really something that we have agency to do in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? What are your thoughts?
No. Go to your bishop, go to tithing settlement and say, I'm not going to pay tithing because I received a revelation not to pay it. See what happens. That's the way I would summarize it. We talk about entitled personal revelation, but what they mean is, personal revelation that goes along with what we say.
Well, and let's give good faith to the person who might do that. It does seem likely that someone could be praying right now saying, I'm very frustrated with the $100 billion fund of the church, and I feel personally like I should give my tithing to other charitable organizations that may need that money or use it in other charitable ways. And they pray about that and maybe feel good about that. And then they go tell that to their bishop. That would, again, giving good faith to someone who, because, if you march into the bishop and say, I've received a revelation that says I'm supposed to go and commit adultery with so-and-so, you're going to have the question of, wait, did you really get that revelation? Or what, The
good thing about that example is I do know people who have felt guided, even claimed it, to be a revelation from God in some instances. They don't feel good about the way that the church uses the tithing money, and they feel like they're doing more good in the world and more in the spirit of tithing to give it straight to charity. The church has not made allowances for that. Now, there's somewhat, we call it bishop roulette or leadership roulette. There's a lot of it kind of depends on your bishop. I think my current bishop, if I went in and said, look, I want to pay 10% to charity, but not to, and I was like earnestly seeking a temple recommend, I think, and that was my one hang up, I think he might give me a temple recommend. So I don't mean to, I made it sound like a blanket statement that there are bishops who would, but I think you'll also find a lot won't, kind of depending on their background.
Here are some observations on that, because you've got two different levels of standing you're talking about, of acceptance in the church. There's being a temple recommend holder and being able to access the highest ordinances in the church, or there's being a member and not being kicked out, not being excommunicated. Right, just about anything, right? Not the adultery, but like, I'm not going to do this, I'm not doing that. A lot of the orthopraxy, right, the things that you're required to do rather than believe, if you're receiving revelations that are apart from that, it's going to be hard pressed to find a bishop that's going to be like, yeah, it actually doesn't matter. Oh yeah, your alternative is just fine, and be able to remain in the church, at the temple recommend standing, being a temple worthy or temple recommend holder. But most of those won't get you kicked out unless it's a direct contradiction to a commandment. I'm going to steal the tithing. It's a little different than I'm not going to pay the tithing. Right, and then orthodoxy, I think, is where you can have quite a bit of personal revelation I've received that goes against. I have personal beliefs that go against what have been spoken in general conference and said, hey, you have to believe this type thing, Adam and Eve being one of them. But I think the only time you get in trouble there is if you go and you start propagandizing it, saying, everyone, this is what you should believe rather than what they're saying, and the church is wrong in that. So in these different spheres, you have different levels of how far you can stray away from what would be considered orthodox or orthoprax. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Well, I think this is actually it's going to lead to some interesting things, because it is, a very fun experiment that's about to happen. It's almost like, let's prove whether, because I know a lot of, and I've made this, sometimes I feel like this too, and I know a lot of ex-Mormons make this argument that's like, well, here's the thing, is like, at the end of the day, the church is about obedience to the general authorities and doing what they say, because like Daniel said, like, just try to have a different point of view, and they say that you can do it, but then you go tell someone about it and they're like, no, you didn't get the right revelation. So whether or not that's true, we're about to see, because there's a lot of people that are now, which is funny, because like, if you haven't listened to it, you should, on the Sunstone podcast, the latest episode called "Do You Doubt Deeply Enough?" It's fantastic. He's addressing this exact issue of like, here he's like, because he's super liberal, the guy that's doing, he's like, here's a liberal Mormon, like meaning like religiously, he's like, it's just interesting that I'm now sitting next to people in the pews that, or we switch sides, because like now I'm the one that's like, dude, yeah, let's follow the prophet, do what he says, and they're like, I don't know, no, he was actually speaking as a man there, and we can't believe everything he says. Sometimes he has the prophet mantle, and sometimes he's a man's like, and that's funny, because that's usually the argument I make from the other side, but now they're making it. And so he's like, I'm going to try to see this, even though I don't agree with like the issue that they decided to take this on, that still makes me mad, but I'm going to try to take this as an opportunity to be like, yeah. And now we can kind of get each other a little better. We can all move to a more moderate viewpoint, instead of being like, so you can see where like maybe we can all moderate just a little bit and be like, authority isn't the end all be all of the church, but at the same time, we don't want, can't have chaos. I know that is one of the problems with, having one of your, what's the word? I have this Russian word, the Krailgulny Kamen, which I guess that's supposed to be the Book of Mormon, but the keystone.
Or the keystone.
Yeah, the keystone, I think, is Revelation. But the problem with having a church founded on that is, as Joseph Smith found out early on, is like, what do you do when someone comes up and you're like, yeah, I had a personal revelation that we should all like dance during church. Like, there's the problem with personal revelation. It is a trump card. You can't disprove that I had a personal revelation. Just like, that's why missionaries, I was taught, that's like, whenever they start arguing with you, just start testifying, because you can't argue with the testimony. You can't say, no, you didn't have that experience. And so in a church that has personal revelation and yet a hierarchy, it's going to be a very interesting to see what happens to that. I think the hold of the hierarchy, for better or worse, is going to be a little looser and weaker, which is what I would like to see in general anyway, but that's just me. But hopefully it's, hey, we kind of get each other a little more.
So from the responses here, the Ostlers and Daniels, no, you can't have a revelation that disagrees. I think, and Joey, did you want to say anything on this particular topic about whether Latter-day Saints enjoy the privilege of that being able to disagree, or whether what do you feel? What was your experience decades ago?
I was too young and naive, I think, to really speak to that. I was probably, and we've talked in the past a lot about like the difference between a very black and white faith, very naive faith. I probably was of the opinion back then that it wasn't my place to disagree with the leadership of the church. If they just gave me marching orders, I should march. If they say jump, I ask how high. I don't know. It's hard for me to get back inside of my head too. It's hard for me to get back inside of 20-year-old Joey's head and even remember most of the things that I thought back then. Maybe I did have a more nuanced position about it. I probably didn't, but yeah, if I were still Latter-day Saint today, I'm sure I would have a much more nuanced position as a more mature Latter-day Saint. But yeah, I don't know how we don't have much more time, I know, but I found something interesting as I went further and further back in time through the blog posts at my church. One of the earliest updates that they gave, or one of the earliest moments in the blog where they even addressed COVID-19 at all, there's a really interesting, they have an interesting take on it where they quote the Westminster Catechism, where it's talking about the sixth commandment, which is the commandment, thou shalt not murder. The Westminster Larger Catechism and the Westminster Shorter Catechism, well, they elaborate on all 10 of the commandments, and it's really interesting reading. If you ever want to like some really interesting reading, the catechisms elaborate on all 10 of the commandments, and they list out just hundreds of implications of like, this is the commandment, but let's just unpack everything it could possibly mean, right? And for the sixth commandment, they talk about not just don't kill people, but also we should preserve life. We should do everything we can to the preserving of life, to keeping each other healthy, to, you know. And so I thought that was really interesting. They cited the catechism about like, hey, it's kind of our duty as Christians to follow this commandment and do what is to the preserving of life for everyone. And so we recommend, so they didn't make it into it's important to follow our civic leaders. They made it was a both and, right? It is important to follow our civic leaders and do what they're recommending. But the reason why it's good in this particular instance is because the things they're recommending are to the preserving of life. And so we're also following the sixth commandment. I thought that was interesting, is that they did tie it to. So somebody was saying a minute ago that like the update that I showed earlier on the screen and read seemed a little bit like, oh, they're building into it the ability for you to kind of like be a conscientious objector to it. But at least that really early update was really kind of tied it to, no, this is our duty as Christians. And so I like that. But anyway.
Exciting. So thank you for sharing that and all of your thoughts here. As we wrap up this very brief question of whether Latter-day Saints really can receive their own personal revelations and disagree with kind of higher ups, a little bit what I'm hearing is that it kind of depends on the context. It seems like we are certainly allowed to have differing opinions right now on masks and vaccines. We hear the urging of the church leaders to get vaccinated, to wear masks, but the urging is all they've done. And there are other issues I know where they've come out and they've said Latter-day Saints can have conscientious objections to and differing views on, for example, their opinions about gay marriage as a political issue. And they've actually come out and I think said, you can hold a different position on this, but it's when you get up and speak and try to teach against the leadership of the church and or try to say they're wrong, we need to stop them, and or give your opinion as the church's opinion publicly and achieve such renown, I suppose, that the church has to say, wait a minute, that's not our opinion. We'll prove to you it's not our opinion by excommunicating this person, you know? And so I think that there are areas and issues that are, I guess another one to point out would be evolution, you know, where the church has very clearly come out and said, we don't have a doctrinal position on evolution. There were statements from previous first presidencies, and now we just don't have a position on this. And so the point being that you can seek truth from whatever source, pray, receive your own guidance and revelation. But if you do, it's for you, right? And it's not for you to go preach and say, this is the church doctrine. And it's not for you to try to convince other people to follow your way so much as you've received personal revelation. Good. Keep it to yourself and you're okay to do that. But then there are definitely a few areas, I think, where if you say, I've received personal revelation that President Nelson is a fallen prophet, and you start preaching such a thing, or that Joseph Smith was not a prophet, or that the Book of Mormon, then at that point, it's kind of like you don't belong in the church, right? So now it's time to do the excommunication thing because you're not preaching what the church is saying. So on the one hand, it makes sense, right? If you're going to go and declare and try to teach the people that you've received a personal revelation that contradicts doctrine of the church or well-established policy of the church, then it kind of makes sense that you've already excommunicated yourself from the church. And it would make sense for the church to say that. But however, that being said, there are definitely people who feel that they still want to belong and are a part of the church, and they've really, in good faith, received personal revelation that something's not right. And you got to give them that. And then I think that's where you fall to this position of, okay, you should probably pursue your personal revelation, follow your conscience and your spiritual promptings, but they're probably not, unless God has appeared to you and told you, you are to call the prophet to repentance and to change the course. Maybe it's just a message for you, right? I guess that's my thought on that. But I wanted to say one more thing about this idea of getting personal revelation. And oh, I remember what it was. It's also interesting to note that in times of life or death issues, a fight against COVID, or I'm trying to think of other specific examples. I had some on the tip of my tongue earlier in the day, but obedience to the commands of superior authority or higher authority to superior officers. This came up for me earlier as I was thinking about war and the Civil War and things. And I guess in a time of real intense, maybe political battle, but certainly this, as Joey says, this fight to preserve life, you could also expect in some cases and in some ways the need to follow obedience becomes heightened or whatever, to be obedient to your commanding officers and whatever. Anyway, I don't think, even though I said that, even though I used COVID as an example of a time of heightened need for obedience, yet we're also using this COVID statement as an example of something we don't need to be obedient to. So I guess that kind of contradicts itself. But anyway, I guess since we're just out of time, we will leave it there. If we want to pick it up here next week, because there's more people want to say in response to what I just said, let's by all means do it. But I think what I've said there is where I'll probably leave it. Just this simple idea that I think everybody absolutely, I would feel, does have the right, and they're encouraged to go out and get their own personal revelation about what the prophet has said in this case and in all others. I really do think that is the line of the church. And when you've received a revelation that goes against the prophet, yeah, if you decide you're going to preach that and try to pull other people and try to tell the prophet they're wrong, then I guess what I'm getting at is I think they're okay with you holding that personal revelation to yourself. But when you go start leading other people, it doesn't make sense. You can't be in the church anymore, I suppose, because that's because that they have to say this person doesn't speak for us. They just have to say that. So anyway, there we go. Thanks so much. Have a great